The explosion of the Challenger demonstrated, in the words of a Congressional Research Service report, the vulnerability of relying too heavily on a single system. Furthermore, expendable launch vehicles, ELVs, also experienced launch failures in 1986, with the Titan explosion and the Delta failure. As a consequence, the reduction in US launch capabilities posed major concerns both from a national security as well as from a commercial standpoint. According to David Tarbell, who worked in the Pentagon as Director for International Economic and Energy Affairs, 1985 to 1994, then as Director of the Defense Technology Security Administration, 1994 to 2001, and participated in the negotiations of the US-China Agreement on Commercial Launch Services for the Department of Defense, DoD. The principal policy issue was to preserve the US space industrial base, which was important not only for economic reasons, but also for very important defense and national security reasons. The Department of Defense wanted to preserve competition. We did not want to have the situation in which we would have one launch services provider, and pretty big-ticket programs at the mercy of one company. For DoD, the security dimension of the negotiations of the Space Launch Agreement was that we had a strong interest in preserving the competition that existed in the launch services market among different customers. At the same time, the US satellite industry was also greatly concerned by the lack of launch capabilities. In the aftermath of the Challenger accident, as explained by the Vice President of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace West, no US launch vehicles were immediately available to satisfy US customers' need for access to space, and the only other available option was the Ariane launcher. However, because of limited supply, Ariane commanded a premium price, and customers needed an alternative launch source from non-market countries. As a consequence, in the words of Scott Pace, Deputy Director of the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce, 1990 to 1993, and later Director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, there was a great deal of pressure to find another source of supply so that the US satellite companies would not be dependent on Ariane's launch vehicles. So that was the idea of using the China option. Similarly, for David Tarbell, in order to compete with other companies internationally, particularly in Europe, US satellite companies felt that it was reasonable to allow the Chinese into the market. Allowing the launch of US satellites on Chinese rockets would therefore diversify and expand the availability of launch capabilities and allow US satellite companies to compete internationally. As Pace succinctly puts it, the US-China Space Launch Agreement would relieve the pressure from the lack of US supply and the fears of European dominance. A second consideration addressed by the Sino-American Agreement on Satellite Technology Safeguards was the risk of transfer of sensitive satellite technology that could contribute to the modernization of China's ballistic missile capabilities. The technology and know-how required to integrate the satellite with its launcher could indeed be used by the PRC to upgrade its missile technology, the two being virtually interchangeable. Director for Asian Affairs and then Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, 1986 to 1993, Douglas Parle, explains that the negotiations came down to whether or not we could find the means by which the satellites could be safely launched without compromising critical capabilities. The specific procedures required by the final agreement were A. Round-the-clock surveillance by US security personnel from the satellite's arrival in China to its launch into space. B. The presence of US government officials at all satellite launch vehicle technical coordination meetings. And C. Prior approval of US government of all data and information provided to the Chinese side by US satellite manufacturers. Thanks to these safeguards, the Pentagon concluded that China's entry into the foreign commercial space launch industry will provide no additional impetus to the development of China's military capabilities. Thirdly, a central consideration at the basis of the US-China agreement regarding international trade in commercial launch services was, in the words of the chairman of the House Committee on Science, Space and Technology, the need to balance and protect both the interests of US manufacturers, who need flexibility of choosing from a variety of launch options in order to remain competitive, and the equally important interests of the US commercial space launch industry. which faces the threat of government-subsidized international competition.